Ever since I joined MSNBC, you know, because you've been watching me on this channel, I have been talking about the F word, fascism. And every time I do, someone somewhere has accused me of exaggeration, of hyperbole, tried to tell me that that's not really where America is or even close to. Well, tonight, I'm here to report that we are at the book banning stage of American authoritarianism. Are you still not worried? Republican lawmakers in Texas, led by this guy, Matt Krause, have launched an investigation into school libraries to see if they're carrying books on certain subjects. A list that includes more than 850 books, and that critics say targets books about women, people of color, and LGBTQ people specifically.
Hello everybody, the Academic Leftist here. In today's video, I want to pivot topics a little bit and talk about something that's being discussed quite extensively in academic circles and on YouTube and even in the mainstream press, and that is whether or not it's possible for a fascist takeover to occur in the United States. Numerous commentators are arguing that if the Republicans win again in 2024, and especially if it's Trump or somebody closely aligned with that ideology, that the possibility of a fascist coup in the United States, meaning an erosion of democracy or a complete termination of democracy, is not only more likely to occur, but some are even saying it's imminent.
They win in 2024, and what are you going to do? Congress can't pass anything. The executive branch can do it at once, and the Supreme Court will sign off generally on Republican-backed mandates. So why could they not? Like, you know, the Weimar Republic had a constitution, right? Like, it's not as though this hasn't happened before. The idea of dictators attaining power and then operating within or flat out ignoring the pre-existing liberal democratic framework. That's the normal thing that happens. That's not like the exception. That's the thing you expect to happen. What else would they do?
Now, in this video, I'm not too interested in discussing what the Republican Party or what Republican candidates actually want to do. It may very well be that they want to erode democracy. I think the evidence for that at this point is pretty incontrovertible, especially if you're talking about the erosion of certain democratic checks. And I'm not even interested in whether they actually want to bring fascism to the United States. What interests me is whether or not they will face any formidable barriers in attempting to do so. That's always the more interesting question in my view. And in that respect, I think, in fact, there are a number of formidable barriers that the Republican Party or anybody who wants to bring fascism to the United States, Nazi Germany style, will actually face. So that's what I'd like to get into. So what are those barriers? Well, here it's important to actually get into some of the academic literature on why fascism didn't materialize in the United States at an opportune moment, namely during the Great Depression and just prior to the beginning of World War II. Now, one reason for this is because the United States has an exceptional history. There is a strand of exceptionalism in the United States, and by exceptionalism, I'm not talking about in the propagandistic sense that some politicians use the term. You know, the idea that the United States is a bastion of freedom trying to bring freedom to the rest of the world. No, I'm talking about exceptionalism in the political economy sense. So what do I mean by that? Well, we can go back to an essay that was written in the 19th century by a historian called Frederick Jackson Turner. He wrote about America and the frontier. And what Turner argued in this seminal essay was that the United States was unique in its development because of the vast expanse of land that they found just westward. Of course, they had to displace the Aboriginal population as new settlers moved westward and as pioneers actually discovered new lands. But what Turner argued was that this frontier and this aspect of U.S. development served as a type of composite melting pot in which class differences and differences in economic status over time were eroded as more and more settlers could move westward, stake out a piece of land, sell it to speculators and new settlers who actually then followed in their footsteps, and then keep moving westward until the frontier was exhausted. Now, what this meant was that things like working class agitation and a strong labor movement were never really adequately developed because the frontier served as a type of safety valve that prevented those type of movements from really materializing because of the fact that workers and settlers and those who came to the United States as immigrants in the 19th century and the 18th century could actually find an alternative to simply selling their labor power, at least for a certain significant amount of time until speculators took over that land and until the frontier was exhausted. But all of this meant that development in the United States was always different from development in European countries, which is one reason why there was a stronger working class movement and labor movement in European countries versus the United States. So what does this mean for fascism? Well, fascism had a couple of purposes. Before getting into that, let's just try to define fascism. Here, I'm not going to go to a very extensive or comprehensive definition, but let's just say that fascism is a system where government and big industry merge together as a result of economic crisis and as a developmental strategy, which also then has a strong mass-based element to it and a strong component of, one, autocracy and also scapegoating, racism, and a degree of xenophobia. So keeping that definition of mind, we should also point out that one purpose of fascism in Germany in the 1930s was to, first of all, find a solution to the economic crisis, the Great Depression, and also to crush strong working class movements. But in the United States, there never really was a history of a strong labor movement. And so the purpose or the rationale, that rationale of fascism is really moot in the United States. Now, later on in the 20th century, a historian called, and a political scientist, historian and sociologist named Barrington Moore Jr. wrote a seminal book entitled The Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. And here he partially built on Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis when he was discussing the United States as a case study. And Barrington Moore argued that the United States, like Britain and like France, was one of the few countries that underwent a bourgeois revolution as a particular path to modernity and industrialization. As a result, the culture of liberalism was very deeply entrenched in the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. The Civil War eradicated a reactionary class, namely the plantation slave-owning class in the United States, which meant modernization did not take place with the participation of this reactionary class. And so a future fascist movement was deprived of one of the strongest elements or support bases it could find, the slave owners in the South. In contrast, in Germany, according to Moore, modernization unfolded through what he called a revolution from above. That meant that the reactionary classes, namely in Germany, the Junker landowning classes, the large agrarian landowners, were never eradicated. In fact, there was a marriage of iron and rye, meaning that industrialization under Bismarck took place with the cooperation and participation of this Junker class, which was integrated into institutions such as education, into the civil service, into the bureaucracy. And so their power base was never really eroded, nor was the power base of the peasantry, which served as a reactionary class or a voting bloc for fascism in the 1930s. One reason why Hitler would invoke ideas of a mythical German past based on this, this romantic fusion of a peasant and a warrior. These classes didn't exist in the United States. However, Moore argued that if industrialization or if the Civil War had not occurred and industrialization in the United States had unfolded with the participation of the slave-owning plantation class, and this meant that there very well could have been a marriage of cotton and steel in the United States, much like the marriage of rye and iron in Germany, and industrialization would have then proceeded with the participation of this slave-owning class. And in the 1930s, there would have been a very ripe, strong base for a fascist movement to emerge and actually win at the election. But in the absence of that type of a path to modernization and to modernity, the United States was able to escape that type of a fate. Now, what this really means is that even though you had a period of flourishing democracy, the Weimar Republic in Germany, this democratic institution was always built on precarious foundations, according to Moore. The moment you had an economic crisis, there was not only a strong or a very large element of a reactionary class and a strong component of this type of reactionary class to support a future fascist movement and fascist leader who sought a way of escaping the economic crisis, but it also meant that there was an absence of a very strong liberal component. Liberalism in the sense of this, idea of individual equality and these Enlightenment notions of freedom from government interference and government oppression, etc. And so it wasn't very difficult for a fascist movement to tap into these anxieties and eventually bring all of these institutions along with him. And we saw this in Germany. The 1933 Enabling Act, which essentially made Hitler a supreme autocrat, was passed through the Weimar institutions, and it was rubber stamped by the German courts, precisely because liberalism as this type of an institution was never very strong in Germany. You had a history of military leaders in a number of these strong institutions, and as a result of that, there were really no formidable barriers to fascism. It doesn't mean it was inevitable. There were things that could have been done in terms of whether or not Hitler was actually appointed chancellor, but it does mean that the barriers were never as formidable to fascism as they are in the United States. And the history of liberalism in the United States means that any future fascist movement is going to have to contend with a great deal of social and political barriers. It's almost unthinkable that something like the 1933 Enabling Act, the equivalent of that Enabling Act, could be passed through Congress and the Senate and then rubber stamped by the US Supreme Court in the way it was by these German institutions. Even if the Republicans come to dominate both chambers of the House, and if we continue having a conservative Supreme Court, it is highly unlikely that something like that would pass. We just saw that the Supreme Court, despite being conservative, isn't willing to rubber stamp anything the Republicans like. They do have this modicum of credibility they want to maintain because there is a long history of independence as an institution for the Supreme Court in the United States. And we saw this with the allegations of voter fraud in the 2020 election. The Supreme Court simply wouldn't rubber stamp those allegations. It's highly unlikely they would rubber stamp something like the 1933 Enabling Act. So given those barriers to fascism, does this mean that democracy is completely safe in the United States? Well, not quite. If there is an erosion of democracy, I believe it will take place in a fashion outlined by two political scientists, Lusan Wei and Stephen Levitsky, in this article in Foreign Affairs, which is basically will take a form of competitive authoritarianism. What this means is that there will not be some type of overnight coup. There will not be some type of a fascist dictatorship suddenly emerging in the United States via something like the 1933 Enabling Act. What it does mean is that if Republicans win and you have a candidate like Trump or somebody who shares that ideological space, over time you may get this gradual erosion of democratic checks and balances in democratic institutions, ongoing intimidation of the press, of the media, of justices. You might have a continuation in vigilante justice, the empowerment of certain groups in the United States, white supremacists who feel emboldened because of the type of leader that's now in the White House. And over time, this will erode democratic institutions and make it far easier to erode individual rights and the rights of minorities and marginalized communities. And so this is the manner in which anti-democratic movements will materialize in the United States, in my view. It will not take the form of something like fascism, despite all of the anxieties that are currently materializing in the mainstream press and on YouTube and among commentators. And we have to remember that this isn't the first time we've had these type of alarm bells. Certain people were also raising these alarm bells during the Bush II administration, especially after the invasion of Iraq. And you had this fear that because of the brazenness in which they went against international institutions and norms, that it's quite frankly that would be very likely that the Bush administration would also erode democracy and prevent another election from taking place. But those fears were ultimately unfounded. So those are my views on this idea of fascism coming to the United States. Again, if you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Subscribing is the best way to help me. And I'll see you again in my next video. Thank you.